But for a CEO, I thought, oh, I think you need them in equal measure. I thought, because you gotta be on top of your game. So I mean, I don't know if I would have gotten full marks for my response, but certainly the value of EQ, the higher you go, seems to increase. You need a lot more of it. What is that? That helps you to really be in touch with the context, the people, their views, their attitudes, and then your own attitudes, your own skills, you should know that, and your own weaknesses, your own strengths, and your own sort of the impact you have on other people when you begin to communicate or you make a point, your tone, all these things. And the more aware you are of those things, the more effective you can be. If you do want to be effective, and I do think that if you do enter those spaces, you do want to be effective. So, a lot of these things are not necessarily taught in our curriculum. I mean, we gotta get you through a lot of stuff. So, I mean, these are some things that need to be learned, and how then one goes about. So I think that's sort of a second part to this is how do we then go about it? Jannie?
Yeah, Lusani, I think that's it's a great point, and I think with experience and with a continued open mind, I think a senior actuary should be able to recognize when a different approach is needed, and also have the ability to advise appropriately, given the knowledge and experience that one had, built up in perhaps more certain spaces. But that I think more than just experience is needed for that. I think we need to be more deliberate in how we develop our actuaries in that field, and it touches on many areas. You touch on education, absolutely. What's sitting in our curriculum? How do we create that awareness? But also how we engage with each other. In debates. What are we doing with? And this is something that's close to my mind. What are we doing with research? Are we active? Are we exploring new fields? And are we creating this environment where we can have good quality debates about areas that we don't know a lot about yet. And I think through all these mechanisms, you then develop the right kind of mindset within the individual actuary to then be able to more instinctively, I suppose, operate with the right mindset within a particular situation, rather than having to consciously think about, hang on, this may require a different way of thinking, And I think we want that to become part of our DNA as actuaries, And you need to culture that. We can't just leave it to chance or leave it to the individual to figure it out. I think we need to work as a collective on that.
It's partly because leaving it to chance exposes the profession to that reputational risk, right? Of bumping heads so often that we get labeled as, these guys are just like this. I mean, already there are a lot of jokes that go around about actuaries, that don't help.
I don't know any jokes about actuaries.
Okay. Yeah.
I would be quite curious, because we grapple with this in the actuarial profession of South Africa, but we also know that the South African actuary is well regarded, and often we are seen as being more open, perhaps, to new ideas and new ways of thinking. So for me, it's interesting that we are asking this question of ourselves and challenging ourselves in this way. But if you look at it from a global perspective, and you've seen this perhaps a lot more than I have, definitely, perhaps Lusani as well. How do the other organizations work with this, which I presume is a more general problem, not a South African problem only. And what do they do, or what is their approach to make sure that they foster this mindset within their members?
So, Jannie, I think it's quite similar to what the Actuarial Society of South Africa is doing. There is a role for the professional body to play in terms of creating that base learning and the training to become an actuary, but the onus is upon the individual to develop over the course of their career. And so there is an encouragement in other professional bodies, in the same way that ASA is doing, of a mindset that has willingness to learn and an openness to expanding the knowledge set as our world evolves. And research plays an important role in that supplementation of an individual's training. But I really think that as each of us as professionals goes into different contexts, it's that humility to ask questions. So starting on the basis of, I don't know everything that I ought to do this work well. What is it that I can find out about this specific situation? And in asking, you have no preconceived notion of how the conversation will unfold and what you'll learn. And then having the ability to listen, to be able to absorb and filter through that, the things that you're going to need to make that role a success. There's also an important aspect which all of our professional bodies have tried to teach, but in essence, Jan, it comes back to what you were talking about around experience, and that's communication. You can be taught how to write a letter, you can be taught how to write a report, you can be taught how to have certain conversations, or at least start them, but you're going to need to learn and to read body language and to understand contextual language and to realize that what you say is not necessarily what people hear. And so to be able to constantly check in with that. So I really think, coming back to your point earlier, Lusani, this aspect of emotional intelligence is vital. It is something that we can attempt to teach, but it really is something that people have to want to learn. And so practice, practice, practice is the way forward. I think there's an important role for mentoring to play, and I know that ASA does quite a lot of that. So this is saying that a professional who's starting out their career may not have on day one the experience that they need to navigate their career. And how do they then get support from other more senior professionals, or indeed people who are working in the areas that they'd like to break into, to get a softer landing or to get a better understanding of those environments. And then lastly, I'd just say that it's one thing to be good at what you do or believe you're good at what you do. It's another thing to be open to feedback. And your perspective on how you're doing is bound to be quite different from others' perspectives. And even if you're doing a great job, there's probably something in the feedback that you'll receive that you can work on. And the approach that I like to take is to listen out for the themes, because you can get really focused on individual pieces of feedback and get lost in the message. But what are the themes that are coming back at you? And therefore, where are your development areas versus a generic development point for any professional?
Yeah, and I guess in that process is also to remain quite balanced and never depreciate the strengths that you already do bring to the table, but really learn to appreciate the things that you may not already be mastering. So it's quite important, because we understand, although we may think that's maybe just our own view, that there is some value that you mentioned earlier, the whole issue of connecting dots, and just the training sort of lends itself to that. It's also there's value that an actuary can bring in any industry where there's a system involved and there are levers that need to be understood and so on. And yes, understanding that there are other people who just are very talented or have got particular experience that has taught them to be able to do the same. I mean, a guy like Elon Musk is not trained as an actuary, but I think he can connect a few more dots than us. Bill Gates and some of these guys can really understand systems very well. But really understanding what you bring to the table, but knowing very well that it can be undermined by the lack of other things, and therefore there's a school that one needs to enter into that would, in a sense, protect and even promote that value that you bring to the table, which is very important. Because otherwise, if you could imagine, if we did not have that thing we bring to the table, we shouldn't exist in society. Because then, what's the point? You know, why these guys? Yeah, he's got a good reputation and so on, but what do you bring to the table? So there's something you bring to the table, but then how do you make sure that you don't get shunned, you don't get put aside, you don't get booted off, and so on, that you can always